How could you get angry at the ones who wanted to be in the game? Today we're going to be talking about Min Jin Lee's novel, Pachinko. Now, to start, we're going to be discussing the contents of this book later in the video, and I'll be sure to provide very clear and fair warning before we get into any spoiler territory. But to start, whether or not you've read the book, I just want to talk about it in a general sense, giving a general overview about the book. This book, in general terms, is a work of historical fiction, and it follows a Korean family across multiple generations, beginning in the early 1900s and continuing throughout the late 20th century. It uses a third-person omniscient narrator, which is a really effective way and done very well in this book of taking you across such an expanse of time and showing you the perspectives of different characters while still creating a sort of intimate feel and bringing the characters to life. I was really impressed with the author's ability to do this and to illustrate so many different examples of what people deal with in life, different perspectives on life, all of the suffering that is involved in life, and all the perseverance that is played out across the generations in this family. Over the course of a relatively short amount of pages. The book's only 400 something pages long and it covers so much territory. Believe me, as we get later into the video, you'll have more of a sense, or if you've read the book, but you'll have more of a sense of how much ground it actually covers. Also, as they say, show, don't tell, Min Jin Lee does an incredible job of this as she allows you to read between the lines throughout the book, not hand-holding along the way, but allowing you to really think about what the characters are going through and seeing all of these parallels between different aspects of the story across time, across place, across different individuals within the family. The novel is full of suggestion and it is packed full to the brim with psychology across all of its chapters, and it allows you to read between the lines as it conveys all of these subtle things through dialogues and gestures and decision making that the characters undergo. And I found it to be a beautiful illustration of life overall, which I believe is the point of the book. Life full of all of its tragedy, but full of the perseverance of mankind and the perseverance of individual families, and seeing how all of these decisions, all these little and big decisions, ripple out across time and across people. It's a really fascinating read. And I think it has you, it teaches you a lot, but also it may just remind you of things that you already know, remind you of the importance of all the decisions you make along the way, how you treat yourself and how you treat other people. All right, now from this point forward, I'm going to get into more of a discussion of the actual contents of the book. If you haven't read Pachinko, then this is your opportunity to pause if you don't want any spoilers, but I really encourage you to read the book, come back here and join the discussion. So let's move on and discuss different aspects of the story. There's so much I want to get into. Different characters, yes, but all these parallel themes that reference each other throughout the book. But to start, I think it would make sense, if you're not aware, to give you a little bit of background on what Pachinko actually is. Pachinko is a Japanese arcade game, less similar to Pac-Man and more in line with slot machines. It resembles a vertical pinball machine. Small steel balls are launched into a maze of pins, bouncing unpredictably as they fall. The outcome depends partly on the machine's design, partly on chance, and partly on the persistence of the player. The pins can be adjusted by the owner, ensuring a small rate of winning players on a daily basis. This metaphor is central to the novel's title and symbolic weight. Just like the game, the characters in the story find themselves bouncing through life, affected by forces that seem to have been set beyond their control. History, discrimination, and loss, but still making their own choices, still navigating through their lives, often enduring with a quiet resilience. Now first, let's talk about Sunja, arguably the main character among them all throughout the story. The story and the entire narrative begins with her. She's a young girl and she's growing up in a really low socioeconomic class. She's Korean during a time of occupation, and she finds herself getting involved in a relationship with an older man while she is just in her late teen years. This older man is in his early 30s, and he essentially manipulates her into a relationship with him. He impregnates her, and it's after this that she discovers that he already has a wife and kids in Japan. Now, this sets into motion the events that take place throughout the rest of the book. But as this man, his name is Hansu, tells Sunja that he will take care of her, he will provide for her and her son, she feels betrayed by the fact that he withheld this vital information, the fact that he's already married with children, from her. And in this single act, she shows that she is defiant and she's self-directed, and she sets the tone for the family going forward as she tells him that she does not want his handouts, she does not want his help. She tells him to leave her alone, and she goes on her own path throughout the rest of the story. And we see that Hansu comes in and out of her life along the way. He's always in the background. And we see the ambivalence within Sunja herself as she tells him to leave, and she tells herself that she needs to go beyond him. But we see that she still has these feelings for him. We see that she still has this respect for him. Sanja's own father had passed away when she was young, and in many ways, Hansu is filling multiple different voids for her. Yes, as a lover, but also in some ways as a father figure. He would teach her things and tell her stories of his experiences. So we see this attachment between Sunja and Hansu from the beginning. And despite this rift in their relationship, they both still have this longing for each other. And indeed, as I said, Hansu's always in the background, in some ways watching over Sunja, providing for her, whether she realizes it or not. But this, as I said, sets the tone for the rest of the story in terms of this resilience and in terms of knowing when to take these handouts from other people and when to just find your own way through life. This comes up in many different ways within different characters throughout the story. We also see within this narrative something that we don't think about often these days, and that is how young men and women, but particularly I want to talk about young women, not long ago, in recent history is what I mean, were thrust into these positions where they had to make very adult decisions, making decisions about child rearing and having a family, all of these different dynamics that they're trying to navigate when they're 16, 17 years old. By today's standards, we would think of these individuals as children, and rightfully so, as the brain doesn't fully develop its frontal lobe until you're closer to 25, as many of you already know. Yet for most of human history, we had literal children being pushed into these positions, trying to navigate these situations. So as we go through the beginning of the book and we're watching Sunja grow up, we see that sometimes she makes decisions that seem naive, or she doesn't handle things in the most appropriate way. But I think it's important to remember she's literally a child at this point in the story. And I find it fascinating that for so long, children were put in this position to rapidly become adults and to try to figure all of this out in real time. It's fascinating, and I think that, again, it just really shows the resilience of humankind. Now, Sunja has two sons, as you're most likely aware. She has Noah with Hansu, and then she has Mosesu, or we'll call him Moses from this point forward, with Isaac, or Isaac, whom she marries. And we'll talk more about Isaac later, but for now, I want to set up this dichotomy between her two sons. I believe that they, in many ways, serve as an example for this theme that revolves around truth versus denial. As her sons grow, we see a sharp contrast between Noah and Moses. Noah is earnest and hardworking, but ultimately he cannot accept his Korean identity. He tries to live as if he were someone else, Japanese in culture, name, and manner as the story progresses, and this denial of self eventually becomes his undoing. Yet Noah's life, in some ways, was a lie from the beginning. He was lied to first, and he lived out this lie. Not knowing who his real father was, not understanding some of the reasons behind the differences between he and his brother, we see his character through a rich narrative that illustrates how lies take on a life of their own and they spread beyond their initial origins. In contrast to Noah, Moses is grounded. He never tries to be anything other than what he is, and because of that realism, he tends to succeed. We see many examples throughout this book that show Moses as being a voice of reason, simply stating, yes, this is wrong, the way they treat people is wrong, but what are we going to do about it? We must persist. Moses tells others this as well as himself. He carves out a life for himself despite the limitations that are put upon him, and that distinction between those who live in truth versus those who live in denial is one of the strongest moral through lines in the novel. Ultimately, we see that Moses' acceptance of reality plays to his favor, and he's able to navigate the opportunities that have been presented to him. Tragically, we see Noah's rejection of reality played out to its natural conclusion, as his house of cards falls apart and he ultimately takes his own life. I think that this illustration between truth and denial, and asking yourself, what are you really living in? Are you accepting the reality of your life? Are you accepting the reality of your circumstance and navigating within that? Or are you setting up a sort of fantasy within your mind and trying to live within that? Because we see between the two of them a really stark contrast in how these different modes of being play out. It's tragic, yes, but it's tragic for both of them. One of them tries to live in denial, and we see how that plays out. Very obviously tragic. The other, Moses, lives within reality with all its tragedy there right before him on a day-to-day basis as he navigates throughout it. So you can't avoid the tragedy of life in many ways, but there is a correct way to go about it, and that is to accept the truth and then work to improve your position in the world, work to improve your life and the life of others around you. Now, speaking of Moses' dad, Isaac, we see his quiet sacrifice. Isaac is a man who steps in to marry Sunja and give her child a name. He's quiet, he's devout and deeply moral, and we see that, like the idea of sacrifice presented in the biblical story of Isaac, he is willing to put himself in some ways on an altar to marry this woman who has no future, as many of them see it during this particular generation, as a young mother who is out of wedlock. So he marries her, he gives her child a name, and he does what he can to continually sacrifice for her to provide. And we see that despite the fact that Isaac gives so much to Sunja and is sacrificing so much of himself, he ends up being arrested for his religious convictions, and the family does everything they can to try to get him out of jail. But given their status as Koreans in Japan, they don't have the ability to exert any leverage to improve his position. And we see that he's held in jail until he's nearly dead from disease and fatigue and malnutrition. When he returns home, we see that he gets to have some final moments with his family before passing away, but he's yet another example of someone who sacrifices so much and receives so little in return. And there's so many examples of this throughout human history, so many people that have given all that they have and received very little to nothing in return. The book also has a wonderful illustration from my perspective of the power and the importance of sisterhood with Kyung-gi, who is Isaac's brother's wife. So this is Sunja's sister-in-law. And we see that this is one of the most heartfelt relationships in the book. And it's this bond between the two of them. And as Kyung-gi is unable to have children of her own, she devotes herself fully to helping Sunja raise her sons. And this sisterhood becomes a model of selfless care and resilience. And it's not born out of duty, but of this love for each other. They are there for each other. They keep each other entertained. They're able to have conversations throughout the day. They're able to work together. They're able to persist together. They're able to raise Sunja's sons together. And I think that this is a relationship that really shows you how some of the most important things in life are the people that you experience life with. Despite all the suffering, a lot of the positive energy, I would say, throughout the book, a lot of the loving nature that perfuses everything is born out of these relationships between people. And the relationship between Sunja and Kyung-gi is very special. Indeed, even the final sentence of the book overall is a reference to their relationship. This book also touches on prejudice throughout the entire narrative and how it evolves over time. I find this interesting, and it is something that is relevant today as it has been for really all of human history. And it's this evolution And we see how in the beginning, it was very blatant discrimination that Sunja and her parents faced under Japanese colonial rule. This was sanctioned marginalization, very out in the open, very obvious discrimination. This evolves as the story progresses into a more covert liberal form of prejudice that we often see in the West today. For example, Noah's first girlfriend, her name was Akiko, who he met at Waseda University, appears very accepting of him. Despite the fact that he's Korean, she's willing to date him as she's Japanese herself. But we see that she's using him ultimately as a kind of social emblem, a way to signal her moral virtue outwardly to her peers, only to disregard Noah's own perspective or needs, always speaking for him and assuming that he does not know what is good or necessary for himself, until Noah ultimately decides to leave her, saying that she is just as prejudiced as her parents, who are overtly racist. She's just unaware of the way in which she is exercising her prejudice. And finally, we see towards the end of the book yet another form of this discrimination in a more self-justified way. It's this exploitation that's embodied by Solomon's boss. He expresses such a Machiavellian worldview where he believes it is acceptable and even necessary to always try to get one over on anyone who is less hypervigilant or less capable. And we see how this form of discrimination is manipulated into a way where it's presented as though it's broadly speaking against anyone and everyone. But we also see that because Solomon is still Korean, he is a part of the outgroup from his boss's perspective. And we see how his boss uses him and then throws him out of the company once he has been used for the means that the boss was trying to achieve. And we see, again, this illustrates how many things in life are constants as things constantly change. And this is a theme that just develops continually throughout the book. And I think it's important to pause and see really clearly how this discrimination is morphing in its form across time, but how each generation is suffering the consequences of this, despite the fact that it's changing in its face, in the way that it appears to them. We see with Yosef, Isaac's brother, who after Isaac dies tries to help continue to provide for the family, illustrates this idea of pride. We see that he adds this dimension of struggle between his pride and practicality. He's fiercely opposed to accepting help, which while it is honorable in its spirit, it does often place a greater burden on the family. He is so reticent to receive any help from Hansu. And in some ways, this actually isn't so clear as just, oh, Yosef is too prideful and he needs to get over it. No, there is some wisdom there, because he's telling them, if you accept help from Hansu, nothing in this world is free. It will come with its attachments. It will come with Hansu being more integrated into your life, and it will be hard to get rid of him. Yes, this is true, but at the same time, there is an element of pride, of a more selfish pride from Yosef's point of view, where he wants to be the one to provide, despite all the discrimination against them, despite all the factors that are truly outside of his control. So it really draws this line between where it is wise and where it just dispenses with all practicality. And this is one of the examples of how the book allows you to read between the lines. It doesn't tell you exactly what to think. It just presents a really real human problem. And it says, okay, this is something that people deal with, and what do you make of it? And I think it's a good question. We see how there are some pluses and minuses to the way that Yosef and to the way that others handle the situation. He wasn't completely wrong about the way that receiving help from Hansu would integrate him into their lives, but at many turns throughout the narrative, we see that they truly needed Hansu's help if they were to get as far as they did. Now back to Noah. Noah's story is perhaps one of the most tragic within the book, and it really had me where I had to sit the book down for a second and process it when I saw what happened to him. He really abandons his family, and I understand that he was living a lie that was thrust upon him really from the beginning, and he embraced that, unfortunately. But I do feel that his ultimate decision to leave his family behind, including his own mother, despite the fact that they all sacrificed so much just to give him the opportunities that he had. And he left that all behind, changing his name, telling everyone he was Japanese, and living out this lie, as we've talked about. We see that he is a complicated character, and he pushed himself so hard to get where he was at. And in the end, as he was running away from this idea that he held within his own mind, this internalized discrimination that he was Korean, that he was trying to run away from this idea that he was lesser. And when he found out that in the end, everything he had done was still tied to Hansu, who was his actual father, he felt that he couldn't escape it. And I feel like this is where things really broke down for him. This is when he ran away. This is when he tried to be more blatant within his denial of reality, pretending to be Japanese. And when his mother finally found him and he realized that his whole house of cards that he had built up and was literally living within was going to come crashing down once inevitably his mother was introduced to his wife and everything was discovered, he ends up taking his own life. And again, this is just how these lies expand and spread across time and become bigger and bigger and bigger problems that must be dealt with eventually. And sometimes they get so large that it feels like it's impossible to fully deal with them. And this is the tragedy of Noah's story. Now, we also have Hana, who takes up a significant amount of the narrative. And I believe that Hana's narrative is a dark mirror to Sunja's. We see that Hana also becomes pregnant at an early age outside of wedlock. And we see how she does not carry her baby to term and have a child, but she has an abortion. So we get to see between Sunja and Hana how these two modes of handling the problem of an unexpected pregnancy may play out. And we see that with Hana, she continues down this road of recklessness and pain. We see that her ability to terminate her pregnancy is another way in which she is personally able to avoid taking responsibility for her actions. And she's able to avoid being tethered to a necessity to make more selfless decisions. She continues to live this hedonistic lifestyle, running away from responsibility. She uses Moses and she uses others, as well as she herself ends up ultimately being used. And this continues until, in a symbolic way, she is impregnated not by another child, but by a virus that she is not able to abort, that she's not able to run from. And ultimately, she loses her life to this. And she pays interest on all the consequences that she prolonged along the way. This story shows us that the decisions we make in a crisis often define us and often define the people who come after us. Sunja is a parallel in some ways to this narrative. We see a different kind of suffering brought about by her pregnancy in the birth of her son. The consequences of her actions with Hansu are very real, highly tangible, and we see the life that is brought through her sacrifices as we watch Noah grow older. The birth and the life of Moses brought about by the necessity for Isaac to step in and marry Sunja. Her grandchildren, the partial fulfillment of Kyungi's desire for children of her own to raise, and all the people that are affected by the relationships developed along the way. Every decision develops and expands indefinitely outwards. This is illustrated time and time again by Pachinko overall. Now we see with Solomon that he has many privileges that his family and the generations before him did not have. I think it's really represented with the story of his birthday party, where we see food used as a symbol to show how things have changed over time. We see that at his birthday party, there's so much food that it's essentially endless. He's able to eat as much as he wants. He's able to eat whatever he wants. And I saw how this very clearly draws a contrast between earlier in the story, just a few generations ago, where food was not taken as a given, where a lot of their day and a lot of their mental capacity was taken up just by the idea of how they could acquire just enough food to survive. And within just a few generations of self-sacrifice of these family members that came before him, he's able to have this party where he's surrounded by excess. And I think that Min Jin Lee really uses food as a symbol for this change across time. If you think back to when Sunja and Isak were married, think about her mom sparing every last bit of money she had just to get them enough white rice so that just the two of them, not a full wedding party, but just the two of them, just Sunja and Isaac could have white rice to eat on their wedding day. Fast forward a few generations and we see Solomon at his birthday party having as much food as he could imagine. Now also with Solomon, we see how things come full circle. We talked about the changing forms of discrimination and how things constantly change, some constants remain. We see that Solomon has this idea that he wants to avoid people really knowing what his father does, Moses, and his Pachinko business, because it's seen as dirty or it's seen as lesser. So he goes to a nice school, Columbia in the States, and he comes back and he works in finance. And despite all of this, despite all of the glitz and the glamour of working this high-end finance job, he's still discriminated against and he's still thrown under the bus within this line of work. And it's at this point that he realizes that it doesn't really matter the ethnic background of the people, it doesn't really matter the career path, that there are good people in all walks of life and that there are people who are willing to exploit others in all walks of life as well. And that's really coming down to an individual basis. So he sees at this point that whether he works in finance or whether he works in Pachinko, it's who he is as an individual and how he conducts himself towards others and within his own business that really matters. And so he decides to bring it all full circle and to leave a life of finance behind and to work for his father, taking over his Pachinko business. And yet again, we find ourselves back here, Pachinko, adjusting the pins of fate and taking a leap, pulling the lever, so to speak. Each day of life is a combination of chance, fate, and personal agency. Sacrifices made, promises either kept or broken. As things change, others stay the same. We either persevere or we give in. And I leave you with a quote from page 406. How could you get angry at the ones who wanted to be in the game? Once again, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.